In this video, we'll have a look at how you can set up lights and materials for Blender cycles in order to create a cool looking render. For those of you interested in game development, we'll also have a look at how you can export the model and import it into Unity. So let's get into it. So let's begin by making a cool render of a barrel. To do that, we first want to go to the top here and change from Blender Render to Cycles Render. Cycles is Blender's ray trace based render engine. It's been a part of Blender for quite some time now and it's really awesome. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and switch into material mode here. And as you can see, when we switch to cycles, we lost our textures. That's because cycles has a whole different way of defining materials. If we go to the materials tab now, we still have our two materials. But you can see down here that we have this big button called Use Nodes. That's because Blender allows us to create custom materials using a node-based system. To do that, let's first split our view by going to the top here and dragging out. Let's then change this view into the node editor and let's get rid of this panel. Now there's currently nothing on the grid, and that's because this material isn't using nodes. We can either hit use nodes here or down here, and now two nodes will appear. We can see that we have a material output. This is where we want all of our data to end, and we have a diffuse node. This allows us to give our object a color, and Blender will then automatically calculate lighting on that model using a diffuse shader. The diffuse shader determines the general color of a material when light shines on it. And you can see we can choose a color here. But instead of using a simple color, we want to use a texture as our color data. To do that, we hit Shift A to add a new node. And the node that we want to add is a texture node. And we want to use an image texture. Because remember, we created an image in Photoshop. And so we want to reference that. Let's place our node somewhere on the screen. I'm going to place it out here. Let's open the texture on our system. So let's hit open. And the texture is called barrel.png. Then instead of using a simple color here, we'll take our image textures color and link it into our color channel. And as you can see, we can now see the texture on our object. Now, of course, the rings are currently using a separate material. We could go in here and do the same thing for this one. Let's hit use nodes. And we could put the texture in here as well. But since we're just using a single color on the texture, we might as well define it in here. However, I want to add a bit of shine onto these rings. To do that, let's hit Shift A, create another shader. This one is going to be the glossy shader. And as the name might suggest, this adds gloss into our object. And here we have a problem, because we can either take the output of our diffuse shader and put it into our material output, or the output of a gloss. But we want a mix between them. So what we do is go in here and add yet another shader, and this time we add the mix shader. This allows us to blend multiple shaders together. So if I go ahead and move this into the middle, we can have our gloss shader go into the bottom shader, our diffuse shader go into the top one, and this value then determines the blend between them. I want to take our glossy shader here and definitely darken it a bit as well. So now we should see that when we start adding lights to our scene, the rings look more metallic and glossy than the wood. Cool, so now that we're satisfied with our materials, let's go ahead and right click here, hit join area, and let's click on the right in order to close our node editor. And let's have a look at adding lights. So what a lot of people assume is that in order to add lights into our render, we go Shift A, we go under lamp, and we add one of the lights in here. However, these lights are actually used in the Blender render engine and not for cycles. In cycles, we have a much more realistic approach to lighting. That means that in order to create a light, we first make a surface that should emit light, and we then apply an emissive material to that. So in our case, let's go ahead and hit Shift A, add in a plane. We can rotate this plane on the X by about 120 degrees. We then move it out on the Y here. I'm going to shift to the top view by hitting numpad 7, moving this over to the side, rotating it around the Z axis, and definitely scaling it up. So now we have a surface that we can use to emit light onto our barrel. First, let's go down here and change our preview to rendered. As we can see, there's currently no lights in our scene. So with our plane selected, let's go and hit new. And the material we want to use is not diffuse, but emission. And as you can see, it's currently casting a tiny bit of light onto our barrel. Let's go ahead and bump this up to something like 14. And there we go, we have light in our scene. Now this is of course a bit boring. Let's switch into material mode and add some more. We'll call this one the main light, and we'll rename the object to the same thing. Let's duplicate it by hitting Shift D, and let's move it over here on the other side. Let's switch to the top view and actually move it a bit behind the barrel. Let's also rotate it around the Z axis and rotate it forward. Now I want this light to be different, and therefore we want to create another material. What a lot of people do is go in here now and adjust the strength and the color, but as you can see, that actually changes for both the lights, because they're both using the same material called main light. So we want to go in here and hit the plus, This is going to add a new material with the same base settings. I want to call this backlight. We then bump down the strength to say 8 and set the color to a more bluish tone. We can see what that looks like in our render. So this could definitely be more blue. Cool. And I actually want to go ahead and add one more light. This is a very standard way of lighting a model. It's called 3-point lighting. We have our main light, which is also the strongest one, emitting either a neutral or warm color. And this is placed forward and a bit to the side. Then at the back we have another light. This is called the backlight or the rim light. This has a more bluish tone and a smaller strength. Then we normally have another light in the front, so I'm going to duplicate our main light, switch to the top view here and move it over. Let's also rotate it. And this is much similar to the main light, but it's not as strong. So let's go and make a copy of the material. Let's call this material secondary light. And let's set the strength here to something around 10. So now when we switch to rendered mode, we can see that we have nice and even lighting on our model. And we have a bit of color detail at the edge because of our rim light. Now we can go in and add a ground plane. So let's hit Shift A, Mesh, Plane. Let's grab this and move it on the Z axis to place it at the bottom of our barrel. Let's then scale it up. Let's go into rendered. As we can see, the plane is currently totally white. Let's go in here and add a new material. We want this material to be, I actually like the idea of this being a light orange. I think we should move the ring light here over to the side a bit more and maybe also rotate it to point more towards our barrel. And if we switch into top view, I also think we should take our secondary light and move it back a bit. Let's now position our view where we want it, switch into rendered mode, and let's snap our camera to a view. To do that, we go View, Align View, and we hit Align Active Camera to View. Now it's all about fine tuning a bit. Let's take our rim light here and move it out even further. And if you want, you can select your camera, go to the camera settings, and here we can change the focal length. So if we want to zoom out, we'll make this value smaller, but I like it at 35. Now when we are satisfied with our render, let's go to our render settings. I'm going to select full HD for our resolution, 1920 by 1080. And I'm going to set the percentage scale for our resolution to 100% to get our max resolution. I'm then going to go to where it says sampling and increase the samples for our render to something like 512. The higher you set your samples, the less of this grainy effect you'll see on your image. So for our preview, we're only currently using 32. So I think 512 is going to be enough for a render. The higher the samples, the more the rendering time. So keep that in mind. And with all those settings, let's go ahead and hit render. Now, depending on the complexity of your scene and the settings you've chosen, this can take some time. I'll see you when it's done. And I think it looks awesome. So if you're not satisfied with your render, you can hit F11, make the changes you need, and simply hit the render button once more. I'm gonna hit F11 again because I like my render. And to save it, I'm going to go to Image and hit Save as Image. I'm gonna call it Barrel Render and hit Save. So now you should have a nice barrel render PNG image that you can send over to your friends. Or I'm also going to go into Blender and hit File, Save As, and save this as a separate file called barrel render. It's a good idea to keep multiple versions going. So exporting the object is actually really simple. The first thing that we want to go ahead and do is delete our camera and any other objects you might have in the scene. We only want the object that we want to export. We can then select the barrel, go under the materials panel, and let's remove all but one material. Let's rename this material to barrel. We can do this because all of our materials are using the same texture and have the same settings. And so we actually only need one material for this object. If your object needs more materials, well then simply leave all of them in here. A really nice thing to do when exporting for games is to make sure that your pivot is set correctly. In the case of a barrel, we could definitely put this at the center of our object. But personally, I would prefer if the pivot was at the bottom, so that we could simply drag it onto our ground. To do that, we shift into edit mode, select all of our object, switch into front mode and orthographic. I'm then going to grab it and move it up on the Z until it just rests on the center point. When we then switch out of edit mode, we can see that our pivot is now at the bottom. So let's save our scene, and to export our object, let's also go File, Export, FBX. FBX is pretty much the standard file format for exporting models. It's good because it's supported by a whole lot of programs and it stores pretty much all the data we need. Anywhere from the mesh of our object, to UVs, to material data, to rigging and animation. So FBX is awesome. Let's just call this one barrel.fbx and hit export. If you now navigate to where you've exported your file, we should see that we have both the barrel.blend and the barrel.fbx, along of course with our texture. The cool thing about Unity is that we can actually use the Blender file directly. We don't even need to export to FBX. But a lot of software do need you to do that, so now you know how. I'm now going to close down Blender, select the blend file and the texture, and drag both of them into the Unity project that I have open. By the way, if you want to get started with game development or just learn how to use Unity, I have a course specifically for you. Check it out, it's on the screen now. As you can see, it's imported both our barrel model and our texture, and it's gone ahead and automatically created a Unity material as well called barrel. Now we simply need to drag our model into the scene, and it's working, but it's currently looking a bit weird. The reason for this is that we often have to configure a few settings inside of our engine. So let's select the barrel material. And the first thing we want to do here is change the color to white. Otherwise, we'll apply a tint on top of our texture. And we just want to use the texture as is. We'll also take the smoothness and set it down to 0 to give us that flat, low poly look. And there we have it. We now have our barrel inside of our scene, and we can use it as we want for our game. You will notice that there's currently an animator component attached to it. That's a bit weird because we don't have any animation on the object. To get rid of that, we'll just select the model, go into Rig, hit None, and hit Apply, and voila, it's gone. Finally, and this is probably the coolest thing about using Blender and Unity together, if we thought, hey, there's something about this we want to change. Say we wanted to stretch the top part a bit. All we need to do is double click on the model file. It will automatically open the file up in Blender. We can now go in here and make all of the changes that we want. We can save them. And when we now hit into Unity, it automatically updates. It's just awesome. So that's pretty much it for this video and the entire series. I've covered all of the fundamental Blender stuff that I wanted to cover. Of course, you can do so much more in Blender than what is showed in these videos. I'll have some links in the description to where you can find some more Blender tutorials. And to those of you who want to create a character for your game, check out Sebastian Lake's videos on character creation in Blender. And of course, make sure to subscribe to this channel. If you guys want to see more Blender videos, let me know, especially if there's a certain topic that you want me to cover. And to those of you who are worried that I won't be doing Unity tutorials, do not worry. I love Unity and I won't stop using it anytime soon. So thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the series, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks to all of the awesome Patreon supporters who donated in May, and a special thanks to Derek Heemskirk, Faisal Marify, Stone Gamer, CMDR Firestone 38, Thomas Vorley, James Calhoun, Cyborg Mummy, and Jason the Tito. If you want to become a patron yourself, you can do so at patreon.com/Brackeys.